BRC and some of the latest updates. Um, Thanks, Margaret, for the recording. Just so everyone knows, this will be recorded and posted to the BRC Canada resources page for participants. Next slide, please, Margaret. First, a land acknowledgement. So BRC is based on Treaty 7 land, including the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and Tsuut'ina Nation. It is also home to Region 3 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Next slide, please. Um, my name is not Jordan Daya. Unfortunately, Jordan is ill today, so I'm filling in. You're stuck with me for the intro and the closing. Hopefully he feels better soon. I think there's something going around. Um, but we're super excited to have Shadni Sinha Das from Clean Energy Buyers Association to give the full presentation today about credit options for procurement. And then we'll have a bit of time for Q&A and closing where I'll talk a little bit about our upcoming events. Next slide. So for those of you who don't know what BRC Canada is, our aim is to simplify and accelerate large-scale renewable energy across Canada through corporate procurement, including power purchase agreements. What we do is we provide internal capacity building for buyers through education, awareness building. We have resources to support the procurement journey, and we offer tools and services as well as training modules for buyers, intermediaries, and developers to help make these deals happen. We've been around since 2019, and um, since then, maybe next slide, we have seen over 3 gigawatts of renewable energy deals happen in Canada. You'll see we have generated $6.4 billion worth of capital investment, which by our math equates to almost 6,300 jobs as of the end of Q3 2024. Most of this, nearly all of this has been in Alberta, which has been where the market has allowed these deals to happen. Um, but we are seeing, and we do anticipate more deals on this graph soon from jurisdictions like Nova Scotia with the Green Choice Program. You'll note 2024 has been a slow year so far, our slowest year since BRC started. And so we are working hard to spread awareness and an understanding of some areas of policy focus that can help reinvigorate the market and bring it back. Next slide, please. So BRC, we're a participant-driven organization. We are a initiative of the Pembina Institute, which is a charity. But a lot of support comes from our participant group, and we are now at about 60 participants across Canada. Over 90% of deals that happen in Canada are done by a BRC Canada participant, and so we can um, slowly flip through some of the logos and the names of the great folks that we work with. We have both a gold and silver tier of membership. And so these organizations on the next slide, please, they span buyers, developers, and intermediaries. Buyers are the organizations looking to acquire these green electrons, either for compliance reasons within um, compliance programs or for voluntary purchases to meet their sustainability goals. The developers are the folks building the projects and selling this green energy to the buyers, and then intermediaries include legal, accounting, market making services that can help bring some of these deals together. And so at BRC Canada, we like to bring everyone together and um, have the market convene and share knowledge across tools and resources, as well as buyer-specific training that we do. So you can find out more businessrenewables.ca if you're interested, or send us an email, info@businessrenewables.ca. Next slide, please. Okay, that's enough from me. We're going to jump into our topic today. Super excited. Nearly all of our deals so far in Canada have been with credit-worthy large companies or government organizations. But I don't want to spoil too much from Shani's presentation. There's a large part of the market that is not yet unlocked because of some of these barriers. And so Shani Sina Das is a senior associate on SEBA's customer solutions team, and she's here today to talk to us about some of these issues as well as solutions. She currently leads work streams on aluminum decarbonization and credit barriers to procurement. And prior to joining the Clean Energy Buyers Association, she worked in solar supply chain decarbonization. Shani holds a Master's of Public Administration from Columbia University, focused on energy policy and gender policy, and a Bachelor's of Science from Duke University in Economics and International Relations. So without further ado, Shani, I'll give the floor to you and you can jump right into your presentation.
Great, Carson. Thank you so much. It's really, really nice to be able to chat with all of you. As mentioned, my name is Chandani from SEBA, or the Clean Energy Buyers Association, and I'll be spending some time with all of you today to talk about credit. I think we can move on to the next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. All right, our objectives today are as follows. We're going to start with a shared understanding of how credit barriers make it difficult for most potential off-takers to transact. Also, we're going to have a shared understanding of how credit ratings work. And lastly, a shared understanding of the pros and cons of currently available solutions to credit barriers. Next slide, please. As for our agenda, we'll start with why credit matters, delving into some current market dynamics and how they create market barriers. Then I'll provide a brief overview of how credit ratings work and why investment grade credit is so important, for better or for worse. Then I'll talk through the solutions our team spent the last year understanding and amplifying, and I'll leave space for some questions. However, if you happen to have a question while I'm presenting, please feel free to just come off mute and ask. Next slide, please. But first, what is SEBA? For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we kind of see ourselves as BRC's sister association in the US. We are a business association that activates a community of energy customers and partners to deploy market and policy solutions for a carbon-free energy system. If you have any questions about SEBA, want to get involved, and want to learn more about what we do, feel free to reach out to me. I am putting my email in the chat right now. All right. Next slide, please. Now on to some of the good stuff. To begin, we'll go over some basic trends in the procurement market. As you may have noticed lately, Scope 2 reductions have become a much bigger priority for companies of all sizes than they used to be. We're seeing pressure from recognition platforms like CDP and RE100, growing concern from end customers, and even growing pressure from some government institutions. Ultimately, companies are seeing more pressure on all fronts to reduce their Scope 2 emissions. Next slide, please. Thank you. On top of that, large companies with big supply chains, or supply chain activators, as we tend to call them at SEBA, are increasingly seeing pressure to reduce their Scope 3 emissions as well. Recognition platforms are beginning to require companies with large enough Scope 3 footprints to include supply chain reductions in their targets. And as of the end of 2023, 97% of all companies with SBTI targets covered Scope 3 emissions. That excludes, of course, small businesses and financial institutions. And as we know, in order for supply chain activators to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, their suppliers must reduce their Scope 2s. So we are circled all the way back to electricity again. Next slide, please. Addressing emissions from electricity consumption often comes in two ways: either efficiency improvements, like addressing how you use your energy, or voluntary procurement of clean energy. Voluntary procurement is one of the most important tools to reduce Scope 2 emissions. And I want to pause. Is there anybody in the audience who does not know what I mean by voluntary procurement? Okay, great. And there are a variety of options at a company's disposal when it comes to voluntary procurement. However, power purchase agreements, PPAs, VPPAs, make up the vast majority of procurement options chosen by companies. In the US, for example, PPAs made up 64% of procurement mechanisms by capacity in 2023. And in Canada, it's essentially all PPAs. Next slide, please. But PPAs are not equally accessible. They're not equally secure, often due in part to off-taker credit. PPA contracts are typically 10 to 25 years long, which is a really, really long period of time. And that's usually in order to provide developers and their financiers with the certainty needed to make projects bankable. That length also helps protect customers against energy price volatility. Next slide, please. But to feel confident in investing in a renewable energy project, financiers look for assurance that the generated energy will be purchased for the entire time period of that deal. So somewhere between 10 to 25 years, financiers want to see that they know that somebody will buy that energy. Therefore, they look for end customers with the lowest risk of long-term payment default. Next slide, please. And while no metric is entirely accurate and exhaustive, the market usually views financial credit ratings as a proxy for company default risk. The financiers therefore look for companies with investment grade credit. Next slide, please. But what is investment grade credit? Credit ratings are provided by a nationally recognized statistical ratings organization, or NRSRO, like S&P, Moody's, Fitch, and Morningstar DBRS. And they're usually used to determine whether a company issuing financial instruments, usually bonds, is likely to meet its obligations. Investment grade companies are those with the most secure ratings. Usually, investment grade ratings are AAA, double B, and triple B. Ratings below that are often called sub-investment grade. For the purposes of this work and this webinar, we categorize any company that lacks an investment grade rating for any reason as non-investment grade, while companies that are poorly rated are sub-investment grade. The way that I tend to explain this is that it's sort of a rectangle square situation. All sub-investment grade companies are non-investment grade, but not all non-investment grade companies are sub-investment grade. Any questions? Great. I think we can move to the next slide then. The reliance on investment grade credit is easily seen in the market. BRC's deal tracker indicates that 100% of off-takers for PPAs in 2023 had investment grade credit. But why is this a problem? Well, next slide, please. While the need for IG credit makes sense from a financier's perspective and even from a developer's perspective, it can make things complicated for customers. There are quite a lot of reasons a company may be non-investment grade, but here are the big ones. One, ratings requirements. To demonstrate likelihood of future success and be labeled investment grade, companies must submit multiple years worth of audited financial statements to a rating agency, and the cost can range from a few $100,000 to the millions. Most US companies and most North American companies across the board don't issue bonds and don't need a public credit rating for their core business functions. For example, if you're Nike and you sell athletic gear, contracting for clean energy is not your main purpose. So for a small company that has a specific core function, this may not be in their best interest to spend all this time and money to get an official credit rating. So it's essentially a lack of need. And on top of that, because they don't need it, contracting and going through this entire process to get a credit rating might also result in a significant increase in their per megawatt hour price for their PPA, which again might just not be financially worth it. Next, there's also the company's relationship to a parent to be considered. Subsidiary companies may not have robust enough records of financial success to qualify for their own credit rating. And in some cases, parent companies may provide a parent guarantee, but it's often the case that parent companies don't want to be held liable for a subsidiary, especially if they are not the sole owner of the brand. In that case, parent companies don't lend its credit or don't lend their credit, and that subsidiary can remain unrated. And next, company sector. Credit ratings are also partially determined by an analysis of sector health and industry-wide risk, meaning that companies in volatile sectors like commodities manufacturing, for example, may be plagued by sub-investment grade credit regardless of individual business performance. And lastly, perhaps the hardest barrier to overcome and easiest to understand is demonstrated reliability. Companies that cannot speak to their reliability may not be able to secure an investment grade rating. For example, companies that have previously defaulted on loans or have otherwise shown poor business performance are likely to be viewed as unreliable and therefore unable to receive an investment grade rating. This barrier also unfortunately affects small and young companies like startups who simply lack the financial track record to prove their reliability. Ultimately, this is why most companies are non-investment grade. In fact, as you can see from this graphic on the right, less than 5% of US companies are investment grade, and numbers are similar for Canada as well. Next slide, please. This means that credit barriers make PPAs largely inaccessible to almost the entire North American market, which puts clean energy goals in question. We're essentially operating with almost both of our hands tied behind our backs when it comes to reaching some of our decarbonization goals. Next slide, please. Um, but luckily, there are solutions that exist in the market today to help non-investment grade or non-IG companies transact. All of the solutions that I'll go into today have been successfully used in the US market, but they face unique hurdles. Next slide, please. The first one is shadow ratings. Shadow ratings are unofficial credit ratings that are best used by high-performing companies who do not have an official credit rating. Next is credit enhancement mechanisms, which are financial products taken out by off-takers and developers that pass off-taker default risk onto an investment-grade financial institution for a fee. Available enhancement mechanisms like letters of credit, or LCs for short, surety bonds, and credit insurance differ in how they address off-taker default risk, and that can influence the costs to the off-taker. And lastly, off-taker aggregation is an alternative deal structure that allows non-investment grade and investment grade energy customers to negotiate a PPA together, which enables smaller energy customers to transact and can yield more accessible credit postings and deal terms. Each of these solutions differs in ease of implementation and the credit barriers that they are most equipped to overcome. While these solutions can be pursued individually, subject matter experts note that packaging them together can yield maximum benefits. For example, credit insurance can be used to lower the credit postings on a surety bond, and aggregate deals may yield lower credit postings or requirements for non-investment grade off-takers. The most effective solutions for a specific company, however, will of course depend on the company itself. Next slide, please. And I know I'm about to throw a lot of information out at all of you. One of the things I will say is later in the deck, there is a graphic with a lot of this information displayed quickly and simply. And I will also be linking or adding a link into the chat to our primer, which is a longer form primer that has this information spelled out in a more detailed manner. So if you ever have any questions or want to read more into it, that is definitely a resource available to you. So first, we'll talk about shadow ratings. Official credit ratings, as I mentioned, may not be accessible or financially pragmatic for many companies. Receiving a rating is a complex and lengthy process because these ratings are public facing and allow a company to receive capital from a much broader market. Therefore, in addition to requiring audited financial statements, NRSROs or the ratings agencies have hefty fees that increase depending on the size of the company being assessed, along with fees attached to maintaining the rating. All of this may be necessary for large companies who need to access capital through the bond market, but this is simply not the case for all companies. Smaller, younger companies, for example, usually seek out funding through different methods, like venture capital, commercial lenders, etc. Unlike their investment grade counterparts, these companies are unlikely to need an official credit rating to support their core business functions, and they're just not financially beholden to such a wide market of shareholders. Therefore, not only are they unlikely to receive a high rating, but they simply don't need one. Shadow ratings, on the other hand, are unofficial, less comprehensive ratings that can be done by a ratings agency or internally by a developer or PPA financial stakeholder. Because these ratings are done for a more contained purpose, just for example, to transact in the clean energy market, The requirements are slightly more flexible, and the process is significantly more affordable. As I mentioned earlier, an official rating can cost anywhere between the hundreds of thousands to the millions. Shadow ratings typically cost actually just in the tens of thousands, which still sounds like a lot, but for a company is not quite as huge, and can actually be done at no cost to the off-taker if it's done in-house by a deal chain stakeholder. Shadow ratings are best for companies who are well performing but don't have an official rating. For the purposes of entering into a PPA, a shadow rating is typically seen as a sufficient replacement to an official rating. However, it is best to go to market with an explicit explanation that a company intends to use a shadow rating. While deal chain stakeholders may do their own analysis to corroborate, it's important to remember that public companies have their ratings readily accessible at the very start of their process. Having a shadow rating announced as early as possible can help provide a competitive advantage. Next slide, please. And next, we'll talk about credit enhancement mechanisms. There are largely three that SEBA has focused on, and they all work by passing the risk of off-taker default onto a different investment grade company. I want to pause for a second and ask if anybody has any questions or is confused about what I mean by off-taker default risk. It took me quite a bit of time to learn all of this, so I want to make sure that nobody feels left behind. All right. So we'll start with letters of credit or LCs, which are, as I mentioned, written assurances provided by an off-taker's commercial lender that a financial obligation will be met. Surety bonds pass the risk of off-taker default onto a surety company for a premium. And credit insurance is a form of non-payment insurance taken out by a developer that passes the risk of off-taker default onto an insurance company. I'll go into each of these solutions a little bit more in detail, and as I mentioned, there is a matrix at the end that outlines some of the important attributes of all three of these things. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we'll start with letters of credit. As you can see by this graphic, which I know is very dizzying and complicated because the process is complicated, but it will make sense at the end. There are multiple steps to the way an LC works. But as I mentioned, LCs are written assurances provided by an off-taker's commercial lender that a financial obligation will be met. If an off-taker defaults, the developer is then authorized to draw upon a certain sum of money from the off-taker's commercial lender. So if the off-taker enters into a PPA and then ends up 5 years in defaulting, that means that the developer has the option to then go to JP Morgan, for example, who was the financial lender, and draw upon a certain sum. The sum is negotiated for the LC and is specific to every deal, but it's typically around 1 to 2 years of project revenue and is meant to cover lost revenue while the developer finds a replacement off-taker. Here, the off-taker risk is passed on to the off-taker's lender, which is hopefully an investment-rated company. An important thing to note for letters of credit is that they are immediately callable, meaning that issuing banks typically only have about 48 hours to pay a developer in the event of a claim of default. While LCs are pretty standard practice right now in the market for non-investment grade companies and banks and developers are familiar with them, off-takers are beginning to look for alternatives because the drawback of LCs is that they draw on the off-taker's line of credit. Using an LC cuts away from the money that you would typically borrow from your lender for your core business functions. And so that tends to be a downside that a lot of companies can't afford. Next slide, please. And that is where surety bonds come in. Unlike letters of credit, PPA surety bonds pass the risk of off-taker default onto a new party, an investment-grade surety company. In this scenario, the off-taker pays a premium to the surety company, who in turn is now responsible to pay the developer in case of default. If the off-taker defaults, the surety will pay the developer the agreed upon sum, similar to an LC, and then either look to the off-taker to reimburse them or attempt to find a replacement off-taker. Surety bonds that are successfully used in this space typically are modified to look as much like a letter of credit as possible. And that usually means that while traditional surety bonds were not immediately callable, experts suggest amending the bond form to look as much like an LC as possible and mirror that callability function. So usually keeping that callability within 30 days as opposed to 48 hours. While surety bonds have been used pretty commonly in the construction space, they're somewhat new in the procurement world. So using them may require some upfront education, not just for your teams internally, but for the entire deal chain. With that being said, the biggest benefit of a surety bond is that it does not call on an off-taker's line of credit. While it may end up costing a similar amount, it frees up your lender to provide loans for your core business functions as opposed to spending money on this. Next slide, please. And lastly, we're going to talk about credit insurance. Credit insurance is a form of non-payment insurance taken out by a developer against the risk of off-taker default. So while the other two were taken out by off-takers, this is taken out by the developer. Here, the risk of default gets passed on to an A-rated insurance company instead of resting with a non-investment grade off-taker or developer. While the developer does pay a premium for the insurance, it can recuperate that expense through the PPA pricing or even seek out more favorable terms from their own lender for the project. That may end up being actually of no cost to the off-taker at the end. Like surety bonds, credit insurance is new to the procurement space, and there are concerns about how quickly payment against a claim will happen because it is insurance after all. But all of these qualities mean that credit insurance is often more affordable than other enhancement mechanisms, and has the benefit of being an off-balance sheet solution. While credit insurance can be used by all non-investment grade off-takers, it may be most helpful for poorly rated companies who may struggle with the higher costs of an LC or a surety bond. Next slide, please. While surety bonds and credit insurance are not yet standard practice, there are some best practices that have emerged from those who've successfully used them. For both, it's important to involve your risk and treasury departments early. These internal teams are the ones that are directly involved with these mechanisms, and they can provide really, really helpful guidance. When we'd spoken to a couple of off-takers in the US who had used surety bonds, one of their, biggest learnings was I wish we had involved these teams earlier because had they known what we were doing and had they known our plan, they would have recommended a different way to approach this. Next, for both, address your credit status and willingness to use the solution early. As I mentioned earlier, remember that IG-rated companies are going into this process with their status clearly visible. So agreeing on an enhancement mechanism and announcing that upfront when you go to market can help streamline the process of negotiating a PPA. For surety bonds specifically, as I mentioned, work to mirror the callability of an LC, and also remember to accept surety bonds in return. When we've spoken to developers, one of the things that they highlighted is that while off-takers ask to use surety bonds, they are not as willing to accept them in return, and that's where negotiations break down. And lastly, for surety bonds, be willing to accept an LC as a backup in case the bond falls through. Another one of the pieces of insight that we heard from energy customers who have used this is that it's really important to be committed enough to the end goal of procuring energy that if the surety bond doesn't work, you are still able to do the letter of credit. And for credit insurance, the most important thing to remember is while an off-taker can't be directly involved in negotiations between a developer and insurance companies, it can help connect parties to each other. So doing your best to introduce your developer to insurance companies, even though you can't directly be involved in that conversation. It also helps to get a preliminary quote from some insurance companies and include that in your RFPs. Basically, the goal here is to do as much legwork ahead of time so that you are actively counteracting what might look to developers as a strategic disadvantage because you are not rated or not investment grade. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, I won't spend too much time on this slide, but here is the matrix of solutions that I've just mentioned. At the end of this presentation, we'll drop the link in the chat to our primer, which has this graphic along with a bunch of more information, but I will give everybody a couple of seconds to read this over. All right, I think we can skip to the next slide, please. Thank you. And next, we'll talk about off-taker aggregation. While traditional PPAs are negotiated with one off-taker, in an aggregate deal, a group of off-takers, often with different credit profiles, can negotiate together. This structure spreads the default risk across multiple off-takers and allows each one to pursue energy, oftentimes at a smaller scale, while still contributing to the development of a sizable clean energy project. The group typically agrees to share the same legal counsel and energy consultants to streamline the negotiation process, which is recommended. Developers will analyze each off-taker and provide the group a common credit rating. Some have used things like a weighted average, and that is used to settle the uniform PPA price and deal terms. However, at the end of negotiations, each individual off-taker will sign its own PPA contract and post its own credit commensurate with its credit rating. In the strongest of aggregate deals, non-investment grade off-takers may join forces with investment grade partners who act as an anchor tenant. If a large enough portion of the offtake is assigned to an investment grade company, experts suggest around at least 50%, the credit rating of the remaining customers may be less important to the financier. Anchor tenants in an aggregation usually face slightly higher prices and credit support pricing than they negotiated for the entire volume individually. But large credit rated companies might be incentivized to do this anyway if they have business relationships with the off-takers or have goals for increasing market access more generally. In addition, for non-investment grade off-takers who are newer to procurement, partnering with an experienced investment grade company may allow them to gain insights into the deal process and smooth negotiations. A lot of small companies and suppliers don't have in-house teams to do this kind of work, so working with an investment grade company that's larger and has teams and has done this before really helps streamline the process. One of the biggest strengths of the aggregate structure is that it allows companies to contract for smaller loads. PPA economics often mean that an off-taker has to contract for a substantial amount of energy. In the US, that's usually around 100,000 megawatts for the offtake to be of interest and benefit to the developer. Small to medium-sized businesses often have smaller annual energy loads and are therefore likely looking to contract for significantly less. For developers, engaging with these smaller companies means spending extra time and extra money to negotiate more deals per project. And in the current seller's market, developers have little incentive to do that when there is an abundance of large off-takers willing to contract for the entire project output. However, the aggregation structure means that a developer is effectively negotiating with one group, dealing with one legal team instead of five. Reducing that logistical complexity faced by the developer lowers the transaction costs of collaborating with multiple off-takers, which puts the developer more at ease. This can enable smaller individual contracts for non-investment grade off-takers. In addition, poorly rated companies may see slightly better credit posting requirements when pursuing an aggregation with an investment grade anchor tenant. Aggregate deals have thus far been uncommon, though. According to SEBA's deal tracker in the US, only about 9% of customer contracts have been signed as part of an aggregate deal since 2018. However, this may change as more developers set sustainability goals themselves, more large investment grade companies broaden their sustainability goals to include their supply chains, and streamline legal and logistical best practices for this process emerge. Next slide, please. The aggregation can include any combination of off-takers, but one of the most promising forms has been supply chain aggregation. In supply chain aggregation, a large corporation acts as an anchor tenant for a subset of its own suppliers during PPA negotiations. Large corporates are often experienced clean energy customers, and their legal teams can lead in negotiations. This saves their suppliers time and money and can yield more favorable deal terms. The anchor's participation may also convince developers and investors to consider smaller, often riskier supply chain off-takers for the remainder of the generation. While the number of supply chain deals in the market is still limited, the potential for this approach is increasing in North America as corporates are facing growing pressure, as I mentioned, to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. To remain competitive, supplier companies are increasingly seeking to reduce their own emissions through voluntary energy procurement. But, as mentioned, while suppliers often lack sufficient credit, energy load size, and experience and employ resources to leverage common mechanisms like PPAs, their participation might be more viable if they are supported by a large customer partner. Accordingly, large-scale companies are beginning to invest time and resources to help their suppliers set and meet emissions reductions targets. Walmart's Project Gigaton, for example, was created to help Walmart suppliers set targets and engage in climate action aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement. Supply chain aggregation provides an opportunity for investment grade corporates to join with their suppliers and help them through the process of executing a transaction. As mentioned with aggregation as a whole, engaging common legal counsel and consulting agencies allows suppliers to participate in this transaction without having to build its own in-house teams, and downstream corporates are better positioned to meet their targets. And similarly, while this is not a common deal structure yet, there have been successful supply chain deals. For example, in late 2022, McDonald's announced that it had joined a PPA with five of its domestic logistics supply chain partners to purchase renewable energy. This enabled the electricity load of all of McDonald's US restaurants' logistics supply chain to be supported by renewable energy. So, as mentioned, while this isn't super common right now, it is growing in relevance and will likely grow as more companies face these similar pressures. Next slide, please. With that being said, there are obstacles to this. The first one is logistical difficulties. It's pretty hard to do a deal with just one off-taker. So if you add more, it becomes even more complicated, and the risk of off-taker attrition obviously increases. And it has happened before that people have gotten fairly far into the negotiation process, and then one off-taker left the process, and they had to start all over again. And that, of course, becomes more common the more the larger number of off-takers that you have trying to work together. We are still, both in the US and in Canada, largely in a seller's market, which heavily favors easier deals with investment grade off takers. I think the US has been in the space for a couple of years. And I think Canada has as well in terms of like the balance of power between sellers and customers right now. And it seems like right now, um, in both parts, across North America, it is very difficult to get a lot of these things done because there just is a lack of incentive from developers right now to think about these solutions when they just don't have to. And lastly, PPA timelines might not match up with supplier contracts. So corporates are often hesitant to enter into deals with their suppliers. Um, Usually, supplier contracts are set for a specific amount of time, and PPAs, as I mentioned, can be anywhere from 10 to 25 years. Supplier contracts usually don't last anywhere near 25 years. So oftentimes you run the risk of, doing a deal with your supplier, and by the end of the PPA, that supplier is no longer your supplier. And so there are definitely logistical challenges to this right now. Next slide, please. Luckily, there are some best practices that our team has discovered as we have done this research, some of which I have mentioned already. One, of course, using a shared legal team and consulting team. As mentioned, this really helps reduce logistical difficulties of negotiating a deal and can be a deal breaker for developers. Next, ensure all energy customer internal teams are well educated on PPAs and ready to act quickly when a project is presented. One of the options presented to us or suggested to us was do your best to obtain contingency approval of a sample project. A lot of companies are new to procurement, especially smaller companies. So doing your best to make sure that they understand this process and are ready to act quickly on a deal is important. Three, pre-align on contract terms that would end negotiation. And four, keep teams between 3 to 5 off-takers. Those who have attempted aggregate deals say that any larger than five just becomes too unwieldy and it ends up just not being possible at this time. Next slide, please. So that does conclude the research that we have done so far. We unveiled all this in a long form primer, as I mentioned, and I'm dropping the link into the chat now. If you click on that, it'll bring you to a page on our team's website. You can enter your information and have access to the primer if you want a place to read all this information and get some extra detail. At the very end of the primer, there is a graphic that lines up a bunch of the stakeholder project timelines together, the developer's timeline, financier's timeline, and off-taker's timeline, so you can see how they overlap and where credit maybe affects the process of doing a deal. Since publishing in April, we've spread the word and tried to help folks utilize the insights in our primer to do deals. And on that note, if you happen to know anybody who might use this information or you might use it yourself, please feel free to reach out. I'm dropping my email address here again because we're always happy to chat with anybody interested in using some of this work or anybody with insight on it. We've also been thinking about next steps. Next slide, please. As we've discussed this work with folks, we have a few potential next steps. One, looking at risk allocation. one of the questions that we've heard a lot is why is off-taker default risk so overestimated, or is it overestimated because these postings are so high and most companies simply can't afford them? Is are we overvaluing off-taker default, and is that why credit postings are so high? Is there a way to lower them? Two, looking at loan backstops, which is what we're doing right now, actually. Can loan backstopping come from different sources, like the Department of Energy in the US, for example? Um, if off-takers are non-investment grade, maybe there's a way to leverage federal support instead of looking at private financial support to help them do deals. And lastly, is there a way to leverage environmental equity goals? Can exceptions to requirements be made for those who meet specific DEIJ criteria? Those are just some of the few things we've been thinking about as we carry this work forward. Next slide, please. And with that, I will open up to questions. I know there's a small group today, so I don't know if anybody has any questions, but feel free to just come off mute and ask if you do.
I'll start with one if that's okay.
Sure.
Um, that was a super helpful overview of some of the options that buyers and even developers can consider. I guess is there is there like an order to them you would suggest small buyers or sorry lower credit buyers consider, or should they be looking at the full menu before jumping into any decision?
Um, right now, because so few of these are, I mean, nothing is being used hugely right now, I would say look at the full set of options. Usually what we've heard right now is surety bonds because they are slightly less new to the market than credit insurance. Surety bonds are being used a little bit more than credit insurance. But as I mentioned, credit insurance might be the only option for an actually poorly rated company. So I would say it really depends on what options are available to you as a company. If you are a supplier and you happen to have a pretty significant end customer that you work with, that's probably the best option. But I would hesitate to give anybody like a look at these in this order.
Cool. Thanks.
Looks like Dominic has a question.
Hi, yes. Thanks for the presentation. It's really good. My question just, I'd like to just focus on, do you have a sense for how much of an impact the credit access is when you look at, the deregulated versus the regulated electricity market? So, whether it's in places like in Canada, such as like at the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, where you essentially have governments have amended, the Electricity Act to say you can mandate the public utility to procure from company A,
Mhm.
at the price that you agree with them. Is there a difference when you look at those situations versus, sort of like the deregulated ISO market, California Aircourts, PGM,
Yeah.
ISO, all these other ISO RTOs?
Um, I would say the only difference, I mean, the only difference I would say between unregulated and between deregulated and regulated markets is just that oftentimes in certain markets, PPAs are not even an option across the board, right? So I
Mhm.
would say that this type of work is really only applicable, I guess I would say, in organized wholesale markets where PPAs are an option. Um, I don't know that like for in the United States, for example, in the Southeast where we're not in an RTO.
Yeah,
You can't really do PPA to begin with.
yeah.
With that being said, I think credit is a problem across the board, I would imagine, but we haven't spent too much time looking into areas right now where PPAs and voluntary procurement are really just not options.
Okay. Yeah, totally. I agree. I understand the sentiment and I do agree with it. I just will just point Nova Scotia,
Hmm.
because they, again, it's regulated,
Yeah.
but they adjusted the Electricity Act to
Hmm.
allow companies to be able to sign PPAs.
Yeah.
Um, and again, because they have a large onshore wind to hydrogen type of play, where those
Yeah.
companies are developing, 700 megawatts PPAs need to be able to secure the amount of power. So maybe that is one outlier, but it just
Yeah.
again for maybe some of my work, I was just curious to see if that plays a big factor. But I fully understand what you're saying.
Yeah, we haven't looked too much into that. I mean, I'd be curious what PPAs do look like. I mean, from the research that I've done in the deal tracker, it does look like even in 2023, all of the PPA signed were with investment grade off takers. So it seems like the impact of even in places where special permissions have been made for PPAs to be done, I think that doesn't change. My guess is that it doesn't change the PPA economics right now. And if I've learned anything over the last year or two, it is that um, this process is slow to move and slow to adjust. Financiers in particular, I think they tend to be, large behemoths of organizations, and I think that they take a long time to sort of like adjust to new options. And I think they're the ones, I think a lot of the deal chain stakeholders will point fingers at all the others, but I think a lot of it comes down to what financiers are willing to, the risk that financiers are willing to incur. And so, unless I think that changes, or unless there's help for them or new pathways are made, I think no matter where PPAs are accessible, I imagine credit is going to become a problem. Um, Unless, again, like governments get involved or we come up with new solutions to this problem.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, okay, yeah. No, so maybe underwriting, maybe making themselves a bit of a backstop, right, to what you're saying.
Yeah. And in the
Just
US, there, like when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, it seemed like there might be options for newer companies to get involved on the tax equity front, which may actually help. I think a lot of the implementation of the IRAs is taking a long time for predictable reasons, but so we'll see how that ends up playing out.
no, thank you so much.
No problem. Any other questions? All right.
Awesome.
On that
Yeah,
note,
and if folks are thinking about questions but not quite sure how to frame it, Shani's got her email address there in the chat, so I would encourage you all to reach out.
yes, and I realized that in my infinite brilliance, I spelled my own name incorrectly in the first email address I posed. So use the second one.
Good tip. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This was super interesting for me personally, and I learned a lot going through this. I really appreciate your time, Shani. We just have a couple slides just to close out here. Margaret, if we could flip to the next. Yes. Next one, please. This is the one. Yes. We just wanted to plug our fall forum that's coming up in Calgary in person in less than a month. This is open invite to all BRC Canada participants. It's going to be a room of market discussion and convening and talking best practices, latest trends. And so you'll definitely want to be there if you want to talk about corporate procurement in Canada. Last year, we our event was sold out. We didn't have enough room for folks and had to, you know, make some negotiations with the venue to make sure we could fit a few more folks in. So you'll definitely want to sign up this year. Really looking forward to that and seeing you all. And then we will have a webinar series in the new year, but we're not quite ready to announce any details there yet. Okay, final slide here. Believe we have contact info. Perfect. So again, you have any questions or lingering comments about what was presented today, feel free to reach out. Either Jordan or even myself. I can put my address in the chat, but particularly our expert here today, Shadni. She would be best suited to answer any of your questions about the presentation. Thank you so much for joining. Shani, thank you so much for your insights and your presentation, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you so much to BRC and specifically to you, Carson and Margaret, for helping out so much.
Of course. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.